It had been months since I'd last felt anything close to excitement. My days blurred into routines: coffee in the same cup, folded clothes in the same pile, dinner at the same time for a man who barely looked up from his phone. Hassan wasn't cruel or careless, he was just occupied. Everything between us had turned efficient, love reduced to schedules, affection hidden behind reminders and receipts. Sometimes I'd watch him get ready in the morning, adjusting his tie in the mirror, and wonder when we stopped looking at each other with interest instead of obligation. That evening started like any other. I had gone out to pick up groceries, thinking the walk might clear my head. It was the kind of dull winter drizzle that seeps into your bones, turning everything gray and quiet. Hassan had texted that he'd be late again, another office dinner, another apology that didn't sound like one. I waited outside the store, the rain getting heavier, the street emptying out. My phone buzzed, a name I recognized but didn't expect: Saad. My husband's colleague that we'd met only twice before, at a company gathering and once when he dropped off some documents. He was polite, always maintaining the kind of respectful distance that made me comfortable. He asked if I needed a ride. He'd seen me from the parking lot, drenched and waiting. I hesitated. The thought of sitting in a car with him alone felt strange, maybe even wrong. But the rain was relentless, and Hassan's call history told me not to expect a rescue. So, I said yes. The car smelled faintly of cologne and rain. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wipers kept rhythm with the silence, slicing through the dark. I focused on the raindrops racing each other down the glass, pretending not to notice his occasional glances. Then, gently, he asked, "Do you still paint?" It took me a second to register. That one question, so simple, yet somehow so personal. I hadn't mentioned painting in months, maybe years. Hassan had once told him, I assumed. I nodded, smiling faintly. Not really. Haven't had time. He laughed softly, not mocking, just knowing. You should. It suits you. Those words shouldn't have meant anything. But they did. They broke through the fog I'd been walking in for so long. Someone remembered something about me that wasn't connected to being a wife or a caretaker. I found myself talking about colors, unfinished canvases, how I'd stopped because everything around me felt gray. He listened. Not the polite kind of listening people do to pass time, but the kind that makes you feel noticed. Halfway home, the rain grew heavier, blurring everything outside. The world felt suspended, as if the car were moving through another dimension where conversation mattered more than the rules waiting beyond the door. He told me about his transfer from another city, about missing his mother's cooking, about how the city felt cold despite its crowds. I laughed more than I had in weeks. When we finally reached my street, I felt an unexpected pang, disappointment that the ride was ending. I unbuckled my seatbelt slowly, pretending to check my phone. He turned off the engine but didn't move. For a second, we both sat there, surrounded by the sound of rain hitting metal. His eyes met mine, not with intention, but with something softer, something questioning. That I looked away first. "Thank you for the ride," I said, my voice lower than I intended. That he smiled, almost apologetically. "Anytime." That word lingered as I stepped out, pulling my shawl tighter against the cold. I walked toward the house, the glow from the porch light spilling onto the wet pavement. I didn't turn back, but I felt his gaze following me, respectful yet heavy inside. The house smelled of leftover food and quiet. I dropped the grocery bags on the counter and stared at the clock. Hassan wouldn't be home for hours. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar. There was color in my cheeks, a faint brightness in my eyes that had nothing to do with happiness, but with awakening that I told myself it was harmless. Just a ride. Just a conversation. Nothing more. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence began to stretch. Every small detail of that drive replayed in my mind, the sound of his voice, the way he said my name, the flicker of his smile when I spoke. It was ridiculous, and yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That I wondered why something so simple had shaken me. Maybe because it reminded me of a version of myself I'd forgotten. The one who used to feel, to laugh, to be curious. Hassan's absence had left a space inside me, and for the first time, someone had accidentally stepped into it. When Hassan came home later that night, I pretended to sleep. I could hear him change quietly, his familiar scent drifting across the room. He leaned over to kiss my forehead, and I almost turned to face him, but didn't. I wasn't angry, just disconnected. The sound of rain still echoed in my ears, and for reasons I didn't want to name, that short drive had followed me home. That I kept telling myself it was nothing. That's how it always begins, with a harmless favor, a moment of kindness. But sometimes, all it takes for a life to shift is a few unspoken words between two people sitting in the rain. It started with a single message. Did you get home safely that night? Simple, polite, nothing wrong on the surface. I stared at it longer than I should have before replying. Yes. Thank you again. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, he messaged again, this time sharing a photo of the sky outside his office. Gray clouds like the night he drove me home. Looks like rain again, he wrote. I replied with a smiling emoji, pretending it meant nothing, but deep down I knew something was changing. That it became a pattern. Little exchanges that grew into conversations about everything and nothing. He asked about my day, about my old hobbies, about books I said I liked years ago. He remembered details Hassan had forgotten. I began waiting for his messages the way I once waited for my husband's. It wasn't about attraction yet, not exactly, it was about attention. A quiet warmth that started filling the spaces where silence had lived for too long. 81st, I tried to convince myself that it was innocent. We were friends, that was all. Saad was simply kind, someone who listened without judgment. But even kindness can become dangerous when it starts meaning more than it should. I found myself checking my phone while cooking, smiling at texts I couldn't explain. Hassan would ask what I was laughing at, and I'd say, just something online. A small lie, harmless, yet heavy. Hassan was still the same, loving, distracted, tired. Our conversations revolved around bills, meals, and his deadlines. Every evening, I'd sit with him at dinner, nodding along, pretending I wasn't somewhere else in my mind. There were moments when guilt would creep in, sharp and fleeting, but I'd silence it quickly. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I'd remind myself. I wasn't meeting him, I wasn't hiding in dark corners. I was just talking, then came the day he asked if I'd finished my painting. I told him I hadn't even started. He sent a picture of a half-done sketch from his desk, saying, "I tried something after our talk that night." It was messy but beautiful, like a reflection of the chaos we were both quietly feeding. I stared at that sketch for a long time before typing back, "You're better than you think." He replied, "Maybe you inspire me." I didn't know how to answer that. Days turned into weeks. Sometimes we'd talk late into the night about things we'd never confessed to anyone else, how tired we were of pretending, how easy it was to be misunderstood by the people closest to us. He told me he hadn't felt connected to anyone in years. I didn't say it, but I understood him completely. There's a kind of loneliness that grows quietly between routine and responsibility, and when someone notices it, the relief feels dangerously close to love. The first time I felt real fear was when Hassan mentioned inviting Saad for dinner. My heart skipped a beat. I smiled, pretending enthusiasm, but inside I panicked. The thought of the three of us sharing a table felt unbearable. When Saad arrived that evening, everything in me tensed. He was polite, respectful, and distant. He barely looked at me, as if our messages didn't exist. That restraint only deepened the pull. The more he avoided me, the more my thoughts tangled around him. After he left, Hassan said, "He's a good guy. Reminds me of when I was younger." I smiled faintly and nodded, but the words stung. Saad wasn't just a colleague anymore, he had become a mirror showing me everything missing from my marriage. Our messages continued, but now with careful pauses. He'd disappear for days, then return with something simple: "You were quiet last time." Each message felt like a spark I tried to smother, yet secretly missed when it was gone. Guilt began to settle like dust, soft, constant, impossible to clean completely. Then came the night everything changed. Hassan was away on a business trip. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I was scrolling through my phone when his message appeared. "Sometimes I wish you weren't married." I froze. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. Because a part of me had been waiting for those words. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down, but I couldn't move. It was as if he'd voiced something I'd already thought but never dared to admit. I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkness. Every conversation, every shared thought had led to this. We hadn't touched, hadn't even stood too close, but the boundary had already been crossed in silence. I knew it, and so did he. I thought about Hassan, his familiar scent, his tired eyes, his trust. The guilt pressed harder, but still, I didn't delete the chat. I couldn't. The next morning, Saad didn't text, and neither did I. The silence between us was louder than any words we'd shared. I went through my day pretending nothing had changed, but inside, I felt something collapse, a mix of shame and longing that refused to fade. I kept telling myself I'd stop, that I'd draw a line. But deep down, I knew the truth. The moment I started waiting for his messages more than my husband's, I'd already crossed it that night as I lay beside Hassan, who had just returned and was peacefully asleep. I whispered to myself the truth I couldn't say aloud. I hadn't betrayed him with my body, but my heart had already chosen its silence. The change began quietly. Hassan started noticing things I thought he never would, the way I kept my phone close, how my answers became shorter, how my smiles didn't reach my eyes anymore. One night, as we sat in the living room surrounded by untouched food, he asked softly, "Is something wrong between us?" I looked up, startled by the tenderness in his tone. He wasn't accusing, he was searching. I forced a smile and said no, but my voice trembled enough to betray me. He didn't push further, just nodded and went silent. That silence was worse than anger. It was the sound of trust beginning to crack. Days passed, but the unease grew heavier. I tried to be normal, but the guilt made everything mechanical. Even the smallest gestures, handing him a cup of tea, folding his shirt, felt like lies wrapped in routine. I avoided my phone when he was around, kept conversations short, deleted messages I'd once reread for comfort. Each deletion felt like scraping at a wound that wouldn't heal. Then it happened. One afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Saad standing there, holding a brown envelope. "Hassan left this at the office," he said. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen him in weeks, and now he was standing in the doorway of the home I shared with the man whose name I'd betrayed in whispers. His eyes met mine for only a second, but in that moment, everything unspoken between us came rushing back: the ride, the messages, the silence. I took the envelope quickly, thanked him, and shut the door before my voice could shake. That evening, Hassan came home and casually mentioned that Saad had told him he dropped by. My heart pounded. I pretended not to care, but I could feel his gaze studying me. He said nothing for a long time, then asked quietly, "Did he come inside?" The question hit harder than it should have. I shook my head. He nodded, eyes unreadable. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to confess, to unburden myself, but I was terrified of the person I'd become. The next day, Hassan didn't go to work. He stayed home, moving through the house like someone trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to finish. Finally, in the kitchen, he asked, "Was there something between you and him?" His voice wasn't angry, it was exhausted. I wanted to deny it completely, to say it was nothing, but the truth pressed against my chest until it hurt. I whispered, "Nothing happened, but something could have, if I hadn't stopped it." The words hung between us, fragile and ugly. That he didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just looked at me like a man realizing he'd been loving a stranger. "That's enough," he said quietly and walked out. The sound of the door closing was sharp and final. The days that followed felt endless. The house was too quiet, every corner filled with memories I didn't want. I deleted every message, every trace of Saad, but it didn't erase what had already been felt. He texted once, "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't reply. I couldn't. For the first time, I saw how far a single line of conversation could travel, how something that began as a tension could grow into a weapon aimed at your own heart. Hassan returned after 3 days. He didn't speak much. We moved like polite strangers sharing a space. That night, I found the courage to say, I never meant for it to go that far. He didn't look at me when he answered, that's what everyone says when it's already gone too far. The truth in his voice broke something inside me. I and the weeks that followed, we tried to mend what was left. Small steps, dinners together, short drives, silent mornings. He didn't bring up Sod again, and I never mentioned the messages. But there was a new distance between us, quiet and cautious, like walking across glass. I realized then that trust doesn't shatter with betrayal, it erodes with silence. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still think about that night in the rain, the moment that started it all. I wonder if things would have been different had I said no to the ride, or if this was bound to happen the moment I stopped feeling seen. I don't hate Sod, and I don't blame him either. We were both just lonely people who mistook understanding for something deeper. But I do blame myself for letting the loneliness speak louder than loyalty. Now, when Hassan holds my hand, it feels both familiar and foreign. I can sense his effort, the same way he probably senses mine. We're rebuilding something fragile, not quite what it was before, but something that still breathes. I've learned that forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a decision made quietly, over and over again, even when the hurt still lingers. I never saw Sod again after that day. Sometimes I still dream of that drive, the sound of rain, the feeling of being noticed, and I wake up with a strange ache I can't name. Maybe that's the punishment, remembering something that felt alive, knowing it came at the cost of something pure. I let my husband's colleague drive me once. It was supposed to be a simple favor, a harmless gesture. But that short drive carried me further than I ever meant to go, away from the man who loved me, and away from the person I thought I was. Some roads don't need to be long to take you too far.